Lyra sat in the grand archive with her dragon ember curled beside her feet, and the ancient texts spread across the crystal table before them. Both told the same terrible story about humans and their savage ways with bonding rituals that made her silver hair stand on end with pure dread and fear beyond anything she had known in her long life on the peaceful world of Velshara, where the Aerith people lived in harmony with nature and magic for countless generations without war or violence or the brutal customs that other species practiced across the dark galaxy beyond their protected skies. The Council of Elders had summoned her that morning, and the message still echoed in her mind like a death sentence because they needed representatives to visit the humans at their military station called Outpost Sentinel and assess whether these strange, brutal creatures could be trusted as allies against the void swarm that was consuming worlds across the galaxy like a plague of darkness and hunger that nothing seemed able to stop or even slow down as it spread through the stars, eating everything in its path. Ember lifted her crimson head and looked at Lyra with those intelligent golden eyes that seemed to see right through to her soul. And the dragon made a soft, worried sound deep in her throat because she could feel her bonded companion trembling with fear at the thought of going among the humans who were said to force their pairs into submission through painful marking rituals and violent ceremonies that bound people together against their will in ways that the Aerith could never imagine doing to another living being. The archive keeper approached with another scroll, and his ancient face was grave as he unrolled the document that contained reports from other species who had encountered humans in battle or in trade, and every single account made Lyra feel sick with worry because they spoke of humans who showed no mercy in combat and who claimed their pairs through displays of dominance and strength that left no room for choice or freedom or the gentle courtship that Aerith practiced when they chose life partners through mutual respect and years of careful consideration. She read about the permanent markings that humans wore to show they belonged to another person, and the report said these marks were placed on fingers or necks or wrists, where everyone could see them and know that the person was claimed and owned by someone else, in a way that seemed worse than slavery, because it was supposed to be something the humans did willingly, even though the reports made it sound like the opposite of willing participation in anything resembling a healthy bond between equals. Ember stood and stretched her wings inside the archive, and the dragon was only as large as a wolf, but she was fierce and loyal beyond measure, and had been with Lyra since hatching from the egg that Lyra had found in the mountains during her coming-of-age journey 20 years before, and now they were bonded so deeply that neither could imagine life without the other presence always there in the back of their mind, like a second heartbeat, keeping time with their own. The other two representatives chosen by the council arrived in the archive, and they looked just as worried as Lyra felt, because none of them wanted to go among the humans, but the void swarm was spreading closer to Velshara with each passing week, and the Galactic Council insisted that humanity was the only species with military power strong enough to fight back against the consuming darkness that threatened all life in this sector of space. They discussed what they knew about humans as they prepared for the journey, and the stories grew more frightening with each telling because someone had heard that humans engaged in combat rituals before pairing where they fought each other to prove dominance, and another had read reports of humans who kept their pairs locked away in their dwelling places, never allowing them freedom to leave or make their own choices. And yet another spoke of the strange human custom of two people living together in one space, sharing everything, including their very bodies, in ways that made the Aerith uncomfortable just thinking about such intimate, forced proximity. Lyra packed her belongings in a small travel case and included her energy staff for protection because she was determined not to become some human warrior pair against her will, no matter how much the Council needed this alliance with the savage species, and Ember would protect her too, because the dragon had already made it clear through their bond that she would burn anyone who tried to hurt her bonded companion, even if it meant starting a war between their peoples. The ship that would carry them to Outpost Sentinel waited in the landing field outside the city, and it was a small diplomatic vessel, painted with the colors of peace. But Lyra felt no peace as she climbed aboard with Ember at her side, and the other two representatives looking just as grim and frightened as she felt about what awaited them in human space, where brutal customs and violent rituals were considered normal behavior. As the ship lifted off from Velshara, and the beautiful crystal cities fell away below them, Lyra watched her homeworld grow smaller through the viewport and wondered if she would ever see it again, or if she would end up trapped as some human soldier pair forced to wear their marks of honor. The airlock opened with a hiss of pressure equalizing, and Lyra gripped her staff tighter as she prepared to meet the humans for the first time, and Ember moved to stand in front of her in a protective stance with small wisps of smoke curling from her nostrils, because the dragon was ready to defend her bonded companion against any threat that might emerge from that dark corridor leading into the station. A human stepped through the airlock door, and Lyra tensed, waiting for the aggressive display of dominance that all the reports had warned about, but instead the human simply stopped a respectful distance away and inclined her head in a gesture that looked almost like an Aerith greeting, and when she spoke her voice was calm and measured, without any hint of the violence Lyra had expected. The human introduced herself as Lieutenant Kate Morrison, and she wore a uniform that was neat and professional rather than the savage armor Lyra had imagined human warriors would favor, and her eyes were tired but kind as she welcomed the Aerith delegation to Outpost Sentinel, and explained that Commander Carter was waiting to meet them in the main briefing room. Lyra followed Kate through the corridors of the station, with Ember walking close beside her and the other two representatives trailing behind, and everywhere they looked there were humans going about their duties in an orderly, efficient manner that seemed completely at odds with the chaotic, brutal species the reports had described. They passed a group of human soldiers who stopped to look at the Aerith visitors with curiosity rather than aggression, and one of them smiled and waved in what appeared to be a friendly greeting before continuing on their way. And Lyra felt confused because none of this matched what she had been told to expect from humans and their savage customs. Kate led them into a large briefing room where Commander Helen Carter stood waiting, and the commander was an older human with gray-streaked hair and a scarred face that spoke of many battles fought and survived. But when she greeted the Aerith delegation, her manner was warm and professional, and she thanked them for making the journey to discuss the alliance against the Void Swarm threat. During the briefing, Commander Carter showed them tactical displays of the Void Swarm movements and the devastation it had caused across multiple star systems. And the images were horrifying, because entire worlds had been consumed, leaving nothing but dead husks floating in space, and the swarm was spreading toward both human and Aerith territory, with relentless hunger. Lyra tried to focus on the briefing, but she kept noticing the small interactions between Kate and Helen, because several times during the presentation they exchanged glances and subtle smiles that seemed to carry meaning beyond simple professional communication. And Lyra wondered if this was the beginning of the pairing ritual that everyone feared. After the briefing ended, Commander Carter assigned each Aerith representative a human liaison to help them navigate the station and learn about human military procedures, and Lyra found herself paired with a young soldier named Sergeant Danny Cross, who had kind brown eyes and an easy smile that made him seem completely harmless, despite being a trained warrior. Danny offered to show Lyra and Ember around the station, and when he reached out his hand toward Ember, the dragon growled and showed her teeth because she did not trust this human who might try to hurt her bonded companion. But Danny simply knelt down and pulled a piece of dried meat from his pocket and offered it to the dragon while speaking in a soft, gentle voice. Ember sniffed the meat suspiciously and then carefully took it from Danny's hand, and the dragon chewed thoughtfully while Danny stayed very still and kept talking in that calm, soothing tone about how he had grown up on a farm with animals and learned that the best way to make friends was to be patient and respectful, and let them come to you. Rather than forcing interaction, Lyra watched in amazement as Ember slowly relaxed and allowed Danny to scratch under her chin, and the dragon made a pleased rumbling sound that Lyra had only heard a few times before when Ember was particularly content and happy, and it made no sense that her fierce protective dragon would trust this human stranger so quickly. Danny stood and smiled at Lyra and said he was glad to meet both of them, and asked if they would like to see the garden level where the station grew food, because he thought they might enjoy seeing something green and alive after being in space for 3 days, and his consideration for their comfort seemed genuine rather than some trick to lower their defenses. They walked through the station together, and Danny pointed out various sections and explained what happened in each area, and he answered all of Lyra's questions with patience and detail, and never once seemed annoyed or impatient with her lack of knowledge about human technology and customs. That evening, after Danny had shown them to their assigned quarters, Lyra decided to explore the station on her own, with Ember at her side, because she wanted to observe humans without them knowing they were being watched, so she could see what they were really like when not putting on a show for alien visitors. She walked through a residential corridor and saw 2 human soldiers standing close together near a doorway, and they were embracing with their foreheads pressed together and speaking in quiet voices that Lyra could not quite hear, and her heart began to race because this must be the pairing ritual she had heard about. Lyra expected violence to follow, because the reports said human pairing involved dominance and force, but instead, the 2 humans simply stood there holding each other gently, and then one of them wiped tears from their eyes, and they both smiled before parting ways and going in different directions, and there had been no aggression or pain or anything resembling the brutal ceremony she had been warned about. She continued walking and passed a common area where several humans sat together sharing a meal, and they were laughing and talking and occasionally touching each other on the arm or shoulder in casual, friendly gestures that seemed to be normal social behavior rather than any kind of ritual. And Lyra began to wonder if maybe the reports about humans had been wrong. Back in her quarters that night, Lyra lay in bed with Ember curled up beside her, and she thought about everything she had seen that day, and none of it matched what she had expected from humans and their supposedly savage ways, and the cognitive dissonance between expectation and reality made her head hurt. She remembered the way Kate and Helen had looked at each other during the briefing, with those small smiles and knowing glances, and the way the 2 soldiers had embraced in the corridor with such tenderness, and the way Danny had been so gentle and patient with Ember, and asked permission before touching anything, and it all seemed to point toward humans being far more civilized than anyone had given them credit for being. But the reports could not all be wrong, and there must be some truth to the stories about human pairing rituals being brutal and forceful because so many different species had reported the same information, and Lyra decided she would need to watch more carefully and learn more about human customs before making any judgments about whether they could be trusted as allies. Ember made a soft sound in her sleep, and Lyra stroked the dragon's smooth scales and wondered what tomorrow would bring. The emergency alarm shattered the peaceful morning, and Lyra jolted awake as red lights flashed throughout her quarters, and an automated voice announced that the Void Swarm had launched a surprise attack on a nearby colony, and all available personnel were to report to their stations immediately for emergency deployment. Ember leaped to her feet with smoke curling from her nostrils, and Lyra grabbed her staff as she rushed into the corridor where human soldiers were running in organized chaos toward their assigned positions, and Danny appeared beside her looking grim and determined as he explained that a civilian colony was under attack, and they needed every fighter they could get. Lyra made a decision that surprised even herself, and she told Danny that she and Ember would join the rescue mission because the Void Swarm was why they had come here in the first place, and she needed to see how humans fought against this threat before she could recommend any alliance to her council back home. The transport ship was crowded with human soldiers checking their weapons and preparing for combat, and Lyra stood near the back with Ember pressed against her legs, and she watched these humans transform from the friendly, peaceful people she had met yesterday into focused warriors ready to face death to protect strangers they had never met. Danny sat beside her during the flight, and he explained what they would face on the colony because the Void Swarm sent these organic ships that landed and released creatures that consumed everything living and converted the biomass into more swarm units, and once a world was fully consumed, there was nothing left but a dead husk floating in space. The colony came into view, and Lyra could see the swarm ships attached to buildings like massive parasites, and the streets were filled with civilians running and screaming as swarm creatures pursued them with relentless hunger, and the transport ship landed hard, and the doors opened, and Danny yelled for everyone to move. Move! Move! Lyra had never been in real combat before, and the chaos and noise overwhelmed her senses as she ran down the transport ramp with Ember at her side, and energy blasts lit up the sky, and the screaming of civilians mixed with the inhuman sounds of swarm creatures and the sharp commands of human soldiers coordinating their defense. She watched Danny and his squad move through the streets with precision and efficiency, and they were not mindlessly brutal like the reports had said, but instead they used careful tactics to protect civilians while fighting the swarm creatures, and every action they took was designed to save lives rather than just kill enemies. A group of civilians was trapped in a building surrounded by swarm creatures, and Danny led his squad in a flanking maneuver that drew the creatures away while other soldiers evacuated the trapped people, and Lyra joined the fight using her magic to create barriers that protected the civilians as they ran to safety. One of the civilians was an Aerith child, who must have been visiting the colony with their family, and the child was frozen with fear as a swarm creature approached, and Danny did not hesitate before throwing himself between the child and the creature and taking a vicious slash across his chest that sent him crashing to the ground. Lyra screamed, and Ember roared and breathed fire at the creature, while Lyra grabbed the Aerith child and ran for the transport ship, and other human soldiers covered their retreat and killed the creature that had injured Danny, and then they carried their wounded sergeant back to the ship while continuing to fight off more swarm attacks. The battle lasted for hours, and by the time the swarm was driven back, the colony was saved, but at great cost, because many buildings were destroyed and several soldiers had been injured, including Danny, who was bleeding badly from the wound across his chest, and Lyra stayed with him during the flight back to Outpost Sentinel while medics worked to stabilize his condition. At the station medical wing, Lyra sat vigil beside Danny's bed with Ember curled up at her feet, and she thought about how he had sacrificed himself to save an Aerith child without hesitation and without expecting anything in return, and it made her question everything she thought she knew about humans and their supposedly selfish, brutal nature. Another soldier arrived in the medical wing, and she introduced herself as Private Maya Foster, and she went straight to Danny's bedside and took his hand gently, and Lyra tensed because this must be the pairing ritual, and she expected to see the violence and dominance that the reports had described. But Maya did not hurt Danny or mark him or do anything aggressive, and instead she pulled out a small book and began reading aloud in a soft voice. And Danny's eyes fluttered open, and he smiled weakly and made a joke about getting injured on purpose just to hear her read to him. And Maya laughed and gently kissed his forehead before leaving. Lyra sat in confused silence after Maya left because that interaction had looked nothing like a brutal pairing ritual, and instead it had looked like genuine care and affection between two people who chose to be gentle with each other, and she realized she needed to ask someone directly about these customs before her confusion drove her crazy. She found Commander Carter in her office later that day, and Lyra gathered her courage and asked directly about the human pairing ritual and what it involved and whether people were forced to participate. And Helen looked confused for a moment before she started laughing. The commander explained between bouts of laughter that humans did not force anyone into pair bonds, and the whole concept was based on choice and consent and mutual respect, and the permanent markings that other species feared were wedding rings, which were symbols of commitment that people chose to wear to show they had made promises to someone they loved. Helen explained that human relationships were built on vulnerability and trust and the willingness to open your heart to another person. And yes, it involved pain sometimes, because caring about someone meant you could be hurt if you lost them. But that pain was part of what made the connection meaningful, rather than something to be feared. Lyra felt her face flush with embarrassment as she realized that the Aerith intelligence reports had completely misunderstood human culture and interpreted everything in the worst possible way, and what her people thought was brutal dominance was actually humanity's greatest strength, which was their capacity for deep, chosen emotional bonds. The commander showed Lyra a picture on her desk of a younger Helen with another woman, and they had their arms around each other, and both were smiling with such joy that it made Lyra's heart ache. And Helen explained that this was her wife who had died 5 years ago, and she still wore her wedding ring even though her partner was gone, because the choice they had made to love each other still mattered. Lyra apologized for the misunderstanding and for thinking such terrible things about humans based on bad intelligence, and Helen was gracious and said that many species misunderstood human customs at first because humans were unusual in how freely they formed emotional attachments and how much value they placed on relationships and bonds. That night, Lyra sat with Ember and thought about everything she had learned, and she realized that humans fought so hard and sacrificed so much because they were fighting for the people they chose and the bonds they had forged and the love they wanted to protect, and that made them stronger than any species that fought only for duty or honor. Danny recovered from his injuries over the next 2 weeks, and during that time, Ember began following him around the station whenever he was out of the medical wing, and Lyra watched in amazement as her fierce protective dragon allowed this human soldier to scratch under her chin and stroke her scales and even ride on her back when they moved through the larger corridors. The dragon had never let anyone except Lyra touch her so freely, and when Lyra asked through their bond why Ember trusted Danny so much, the dragon sent back feelings of warmth and safety and the sense that this human understood how to be gentle with creatures who could be dangerous, and that understanding made him worthy of trust. Danny explained to Lyra that he had grown up on a farm back on Earth and he had worked with animals since he was a child, and his family had taught him that strength without gentleness was just violence. But gentleness backed by strength was true power, and he lived by that philosophy in everything he did. Meanwhile, the Void Swarm attacks were intensifying across the sector, and the Galactic Council was demanding that the Aerith and humans coordinate a joint military operation because neither species alone had the resources to stop the swarm advance, and if they did not act soon, both their homeworlds would be consumed. Lyra proposed a daring plan to Commander Carter and the Council representatives, and she suggested using Aerith magic to cloak human warships, which would allow them to get close to the swarm hive nodes without being detected and then strike at the heart of the enemy before they could mount a defense. The plan was brilliant, but it required perfect synchronization between Aerith mages and human pilots, and that kind of coordination only came from deep trust and understanding and the ability to work together as seamlessly as bonded pairs, which meant they needed to train together intensively before attempting such a dangerous mission. Lyra and Danny were put in charge of the training program, and they spent long days teaching their respective teams how to work together. And Lyra showed human soldiers how to sense the magical currents that Aerith mages used for cloaking, while Danny taught Aerith warriors the aggressive combat tactics that humans had perfected through centuries of warfare. During one training exercise, Lyra was demonstrating aerial maneuvers with Ember when her wing clipped a support beam, and she crashed hard to the training floor, and pain shot through her body as she felt bones crack and her wing bend at an unnatural angle. Danny was at her side in seconds, and he carefully examined her injuries with gentle hands, and he kept asking permission before touching her and explaining what he was doing and why. and Lyra realized that this was what human pairing really meant, which was always asking for consent and always putting the other person comfort first. He carried her to the medical wing and stayed with her while the doctors set her wing and gave her medication for the pain, and he told her stories about his childhood on the farm to distract her from the discomfort, and his voice was soothing and kind, and Lyra found herself relaxing despite the pain. That night after the doctors had left, Danny sat beside her bed, and he told her about his wife who had died in a void swarm attack 3 years ago, and how he had been on a different ship when it happened, and by the time he got to her location there was nothing left but debris and the terrible certainty that she was gone. He showed Lyra the wedding ring he still wore on a chain around his neck, and he explained that his wife's name had been Sophie, and they had chosen each other when they were both very young, and every day after that, they had continued choosing each other, and that daily choice was what made their bond. Sacred tears ran down Danny's face as he talked about Sophie, and he did not try to hide them or pretend he was not grieving, because humans believed that showing emotion was a strength rather than a weakness, and the ability to cry for someone you lost meant that you had loved them deeply enough to risk that pain. Lyra reached out and took Danny's hand, and she understood now why humans fought so fiercely against the void swarm, because they were not just fighting for territory or resources, but for the people they loved, and the bonds they had chosen, and the future they wanted to protect for those who would come after them. Over the following weeks, as Lyra's wing healed, she and Danny spent more time together, and they discovered they enjoyed each other company beyond just the training requirements, and they would sit in the observation deck watching the stars and talking about their different cultures and finding surprising similarities beneath the surface differences. Ember was always with them during these quiet moments, and the dragon would curl up between them and purr contentedly. And Lyra realized that her dragon had already accepted Danny as part of their small family unit, and the bond between the three of them was growing stronger with each passing day. The other Aerith representatives reported back to the Council on Velshara, and they confirmed that humans were not the savage, brutal species that the intelligence reports had described, and instead they were complex people capable of both fierce violence in defense of others and incredible gentleness with those they cared about. The Council approved the joint military operation, and the combined Aerith-human fleet began final preparations for the assault on the Void Swarm hive nodes, and everyone knew this would be the most dangerous mission any of them had ever undertaken, and many would not survive to see the victory. The night before the battle, Lyra could not sleep, and she went to the observation deck where she found Danny already there, staring out at the stars, and he smiled when he saw her and Ember, and he made room for them to sit beside him. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, and then Danny asked if Lyra was afraid of dying tomorrow, and she admitted that yes, she was terrified, because she had so much. She still wanted to do an experience, and there were people she cared about that she did not want to leave behind. Danny nodded and said he understood that fear completely, and then he asked if she would do him a favor, and if they both survived the battle, would she consider going to dinner with him somewhere nice when they got back to the station, and it took Lyra a moment to realize he was asking her on a date. Her heart raced, and she felt confused and frightened and excited all at the same time, because she had come to care deeply for this gentle human soldier, and the thought of exploring a relationship with him made her both nervous and happy, and she realized this must be how pairing bonds began. She told Danny yes, she would like to have dinner with him if they survived, and he smiled and took her hand gently, and they sat together watching the stars with Ember purring between them. And Lyra understood finally why humans valued these chosen bonds so highly, because nothing in her life had ever felt quite like this moment. The combined fleet assembled in deep space, and Lyra stood on the bridge of the flagship with other Aerith mages, while Danny coordinated with human pilots from the tactical station, and the energy between them hummed with anticipation and fear because everyone knew this mission would determine the fate of multiple worlds. Commander Carter gave the order, and the Aerith mages began weaving their cloaking magic around the human warships, and the fleet shimmered and faded from normal space and became invisible to swarm sensors as they began their approach to the hive nodes deep in enemy territory. The journey took 6 hours, and during that time Lyra maintained her portion of the cloaking spell while monitoring the magical currents that flowed through the fleet, and beside her, other mages worked in perfect synchronization with human crew members who had learned to feel the subtle shifts in the magic and adjust their systems accordingly. Ember stayed close to Lyra throughout the approach, and the dragon presence in her mind was a constant source of comfort and strength, and Lyra drew on that bond to maintain her focus, even as fatigue began to set in from the sustained magical effort. They emerged from cloak directly inside the swarm territory, and the hive nodes floated before them like massive organic tumors in space, and the fleet opened fire with every weapon they had, and the battle began in earnest. The swarm responded with terrifying speed, and their organic ships swarmed out of the hive nodes like angry insects, and the space between the fleets filled with weapons fire and explosions and the screams of dying ships on both sides. Lyra coordinated defensive shields with the human tactical officers, and together they managed to protect the flagship from the worst of the swarm attacks, while the human weapons carved into the hive nodes and began destroying the enemy infrastructure piece by piece. A swarm hive ship broke through the defensive line and rammed into the flagship hull, and alarms blared as the ship integrity was compromised, and swarm creatures began pouring through the breach into the interior corridors. Danny grabbed his weapon and assembled his squad to repel the boarders, and Lyra made a split-second decision to go with him, because she and Ember could fight and she was not going to hide on the bridge while others risked their lives. The corridors were chaos as human soldiers fought hand-to-hand with swarm creatures that were all teeth and claws and chitinous armor, and Lyra used her magic to create barriers and blast creatures away, while Ember breathed fire and tore into enemies with her claws and teeth. They fought their way toward the breach point, where the swarm ship had attached itself, and the squad was outnumbered and running low on ammunition, but they held the line because giving ground meant the creatures would reach the engine room and destroy the ship from within. A massive swarm warrior broke through the human defensive line and charged straight at Danny, and he fired his weapon until it clicked empty, and then he drew his combat knife and prepared to fight hand-to-hand. But the creature was too fast and too strong. Lyra threw herself between Danny and the creature, and she raised a magical barrier just as the warrior claws came down, and the impact shattered her shield and sent her crashing into the wall. But she had bought enough time for Ember to reach them, and the dragon tore into the warrior with savage fury. More swarm creatures poured through the breach, and the squad was being pushed back, and Lyra knew they could not hold much longer, and she looked at Danny and saw the same knowledge in his eyes, and they both understood that they might die here in this corridor far from home. But then reinforcements arrived as more human soldiers and several Aerith warriors joined the fight, and together they pushed back against the swarm creatures and finally managed to seal the breach with emergency force fields that cut off the flow of enemies. Commander Carter's voice came over the communication system, and she announced that the hive nodes were being destroyed, but the swarm central command node had detected the attack and was sending a massive counter-assault, and the flagship was directly in its path. The commander made a decision that everyone knew was coming, and she ordered all non-essential personnel to evacuate to the escape pods, while she piloted the flagship on a collision course with the swarm central node, because the resulting explosion would destroy the enemy command structure and end the swarm ability to coordinate attacks. Kate Morrison was on the bridge with Helen, and when the evacuation order came, she refused to leave and asked permission to stay with her commander. And Helen looked at her for a long moment, before nodding, and they clasped hands, Knowing they were choosing to die together, Lyra watched through the tactical display as the flagship accelerated toward the central node, and she saw other ships moving to cover the escape pods and protect the evacuating crew, and then the flagship hit the node, and the explosion lit up space like a new star being born. The swarm forces fell into chaos without their central coordination, and the remaining human and Aerith ships pressed their advantage and destroyed the scattered enemy vessels, and within hours the battle was over, and the swarm presence in this sector was broken. In the aftermath, Lyra sat in the medical bay of one of the surviving ships, while doctors treated her injuries from the battle, and Danny was there too, with bandages wrapped around his ribs and a cut above his eye, and they looked at each other and realized they had both survived when so many others had not. They attended the memorial service for Commander Carter and Lieutenant Morrison and all the other fallen warriors from both species, and Lyra gave a speech about how Helen and Kate had shown the true meaning of human bonding by choosing to face death together rather than abandon each other. She spoke about how the Aerith had misunderstood humans for so long and thought their pairing rituals were brutal and forced, when in reality they were based on choice and consent and the willingness to sacrifice everything for someone you loved. The service ended and people dispersed to grieve in their own ways, and Lyra found herself standing with Danny and Ember in a quiet corner of the memorial hall, and he asked if she still wanted to have that dinner together, and she smiled and said yes. Weeks later, Lyra returned to Velshara to report to the council, and she wore a small pendant that Danny had given her, and it was a simple design, but it meant everything because it represented the beginning of a bond built on choice and mutual respect. She stood before the Council of Elders and corrected all the misconceptions about humanity that had led to such fear and misunderstanding, and she explained that humans did not conquer through force but through connection, and their ability to form deep bonds was their greatest strength, not their weakness. The Council approved a formal alliance with humanity and authorized cultural exchange programs so that more Aerith could learn about human customs without fear. And Lyra volunteered to coordinate these programs because she understood both cultures now and could help bridge the gap between them. Back in her quarters that night, Lyra set up a long-range communication link with Danny, who was still at Outpost Sentinel, and they talked for hours about everything and nothing, and Ember slept on a shirt that Danny had given Lyra, and the dragon scent was mixed with his now. Other Aerith asked Lyra if she had been paired with the human soldier, and she smiled and said not yet, but maybe someday if they both continued to choose each other the way humans did with their bonds, because she had learned that the strongest relationships were the ones built slowly with trust and respect. She looked out her window at the stars and knew that Danny was out there somewhere, looking at the same stars and thinking about her, and the thought made her heart feel full in a way she had never experienced before. The most terrifying thing about humans was not their pairing rituals or their capacity for violence, but how easily they made you want to be part of their world and share in their bonds and open your heart to the possibility of love. Lyra had come to Outpost Sentinel expecting to find savage warriors who forced others into submission, but instead she had found people who valued choice above all else, and who were willing to die for those they loved, and who showed her that vulnerability was not weakness, but the foundation of true strength. She touched the pendant Danny had given her and smiled, because she understood now what it meant to choose someone and be chosen in return. And whatever the future held, she knew she would face it with her dragon beside her, and a human soldier in her heartship, and participate in their savage bonding ceremonies that everyone spoke about with such fear and disgust. The journey through space took 3 days, and with each passing hour, Lyra felt her anxiety growing stronger because soon she would come face to face with humans for the first time in her life, and she had no idea What to expect beyond the terrible stories and frightening reports that filled her mind with images of brutal warriors who took what they wanted without asking and bound their pairs through force rather than choice. Ember stayed close during the journey, and the dragon rarely left Lyra's side, except to eat the meat that the ship crew provided, and even then she ate quickly and returned to curl up against Lyra's legs, providing comfort through physical contact and the warm presence in her mind that reminded her she was not alone, no matter what horrors awaited them at their destination. On the third day, the ship's sensors detected outpost sentinel ahead, and Lyra moved to the viewport to see the massive military station floating in space like a fortress of metal and weapons that looked nothing like the organic flowing architecture of Aerith buildings, and everything about it seemed designed to intimidate and threaten anyone who approached without permission. The other representatives joined her at the viewport, and they all stared at the human station in silence because words seemed inadequate to express their fear and worry about what would happen when they docked and met the humans face to face and had to somehow convince these brutal warriors to help fight the Void Swarm without becoming their forced pairs in the process. The ship captain announced they would dock in 10 minutes. And Lyra picked up her staff with trembling hands, while Ember pressed against her legs and growled softly at the viewport, as if she could sense the danger waiting for them beyond that cold metal wall.